welcome to another episode of TDNY. This day, not here. The podcast that looks back at the history of the week ahead. On this episode, we'll be covering stories from the 14th to the 20th of April. As ever, we have our usual song pairing for each story, and the dreaded quiz at the end of the episode. So prepare for that and pay attention along the way, as on this episode we'll learn about an infamous Old West shootout, about an imaginary drug addict, the dangers of shipping ammonium nitrate, and the first female solo flight around the world, plus a whole lot more along the way. So let's kick the week off with Monday, April 14th. On this day, not year, the town wasn't big enough for the 5 of these individuals. Dallas Studenmeyer, also known as the Butcher, for reasons we'll soon see why, was born December 11th, 1845. At 15 years old and standing 6 feet tall, he enlisted in the American Civil War, during which he grew to 6 foot 4 inches and taught himself how to shoot with either hand, carrying twin pistols wherever he went. Eventually, working as a town marshal in New Mexico, he was recommended for the same role in the lawless border town of El Paso, Texas. The area around El Paso had been inhabited for thousands of years, known as a land for growing maize. During the late 1500s, it was claimed by the Spanish, and by the 18th century had a population of around 5,000 people. The Confederacy had control of nearby Fort Bliss during the Civil War, and spurred further growth to the area after the war ended. This growth was helped along as 3 train lines were connected to the town in 1881. Which is where we find ourselves and Dallas Studenmeyer now. April 11th, 1881. The past 8 months had seen the violent and troubled town go through 6 marshals, and Bill Johnson was about to be the 7th. Described in a 1953 Daily Mail edition as a simpleton, weakling, and a drunkard. Dallas found him drinking away his day in a saloon. After announcing he had been hired to relieve him, Dallas demanded the keys to the jail from Bill, found his response lacking, and again from the Daily Mail article, the new marshal thereupon thrust out a long arm and shook his predecessor until his teeth rattled. Then he took the keys from the dazed man's pocket and strolled out to open the lock-up for business. And it wasn't long until business found him. In the days after Studenmeyer's arrival, 2 Mexicans had been tracking down a herd of their stolen cattle, an act that would see them killed. This wasn't anything unusual in 1881 America. A look at the New York Times around this same time shows a grocery store clerk shot without provocation, a woman hung by a mob under the accusation she was an arsonist, a man killed over an argument about gardening equipment, a trial over a slain police officer, robbed bodies found floating in rivers, among many other such stories. But just because such acts were common, it doesn't mean they went unpunished. April 14th, the duo never returning, an armed group of 75 Mexicans were allowed entry into the city by the mayor, the group accompanied by Constable Gus Kremkow, to search for their missing party. Their bodies were found just outside the ranch of John Hale, a suspected cattle thief. John and 2 of his associates, Hervey and Fredericks, were rounded up, and together with Gus Kremkow and Dallas Studenmeyer, plus the families of the deceased, all found themselves in the justice's office, with an inquest into the shooting taking place. Another in the room was George Campbell. a previous marshal of the town and friend of John Hale's. The inquest determined the two associates of Hale's, Purvey and Fredericks, had been responsible for the killings. Gus Krempkow acted as an interpreter for the victims' families, who supposedly laid a lot of blame at the feet of John Hale. Eventually, the hour grew late, and a later date was set for the trial. Not all tempers were quelled at this announcement, however. Studenmeyer left the room to head towards a diner next door, while Krempkow went to the saloon across the street to retrieve his guns, stowed before the inquest. Upon exiting, he was ambushed by John Hale and George Campbell, the pair accusing Krempkow of being too friendly with the Mexicans, and maybe mistranslating what was said to stretch the evidence in their favor. John Hale, who had been drinking, produced a pistol. Some reports claim he had snatched away one of Krempkow's, while another states a supporter slipped him one during the inquest. In either case, he called out to Campbell, "George, I've got you covered." What happened next was reported in the New York Times as "The Riot at El Paso" and "An Affray in a Border Town." But today it is known by a different name: the 4 Dead in 5 Seconds gunfight. Hale pulled the trigger, shooting Krempkow, who fell back against the saloon's door. On hearing the shot, Dallas Studenmeyer was in the street, both hands reaching into his pockets and coming out filled with his guns as he rushed towards the saloon. Campbell had ducked inside, while Hale had hidden, taking refuge behind a brick pillar. Studenmeyer fired, striking an innocent bystander, killing him instantly. Hale peered out and was struck in the forehead by the second shot. On seeing Hale fall, George Campbell exited the saloon, yelling out that this either wasn't his or Studenmeyer's fight. But it was Krempkow's. Down but not out, he fired twice at the armed Campbell, striking him in the foot and also hitting his gun, flinging it from his grasp and breaking his wrist in the process. Campbell stooped down, picking up the gun with his left hand, only to straighten and find Studenmeyer's pistols pointed his direction. 3 shots rang out, taking Campbell in the stomach. His last words, "You big son of a bitch, you murdered me." If you can believe the legend, only 5 seconds had passed since John Hale fired that first shot, but now 4 men lay dead in the streets of El Paso. Hale, Constable Gus Krempkow, former Marshal George Campbell, and an innocent bystander. This wouldn't be the last former marshal that Studenmeyer would shoot that week either. The Manning brothers, a criminal element of the town, and friends of the now-deceased Hale and Campbell, wanted revenge. They used the humiliated former marshal, Bill Johnson, as their agent in this plot, plying him with alcohol, supplying him with a shotgun, and placing him in the path of Studenmeyer on the 17th. They had hoped all would solve itself. Unfortunately, Johnson's shots went wide, and Studenmeyer immediately returned fire. A shot going low and, severed Johnson's deputies? The next time you're shopping and see some old El Paso beans, spare a thought for old Johnson, who departed this life relieved of his. While crime and lawlessness did take a sharp dip under Studenmeyer's quick draw, it was only temporary. Dallas Studenmeyer met his end in September 1882, the Manning brothers finally having their revenge and taking control of the town. While researching for this story, I did find a band called 4 Dead in 5 Seconds, a metal group from Queensland, Australia. Although fitting in name, I think a much better fitting in theme pairing can be found in the works of Ennio Morricone, From the Good, the Bad and the Ugly soundtrack, the song The Trio. It plays during the film's climax, as the three armed fighters stand off, hands by their guns, waiting to see who'll be the first to break. While the stories aren't one for one, Studenmeyer being no man with no name, this iconic soundtrack is definitely a fitting pairing for one of the last iconic gunfights of the Old West. Tuesday, April 15th. On this day, not year, the Pulitzer doesn't go to... The Pulitzer Prize, created by newspaper magnate Joseph Pulitzer. 23 yearly awards presented by New York Columbia's University. The prizes cover a range of arts and disciplines: music, poetry, autobiography and memoir, but, most famously, and most pertinent for our story today, they are also given out for many fields in journalism and reporting. The prize for winning, other than recognition for outstanding performance, and a certificate, is $15,000, although that is only from 2017 onwards. Between 2004 and 2017, it was $10,000, and before 2004 it was $7,500. Works submitted for the prize are deliberated over by a jury of selected individuals, who narrow these entrants down to just a few nominated finalists and the eventual winner. As per Pulitzer.org, those entries may be made by any individual based on material coming from a United States newspaper, magazine, or news site that publishes regularly during the calendar year and adheres to the highest journalistic principles. Which should surprise nobody to learn that Fox News has never won a Pulitzer Prize. The winner for the 1981 Pulitzer for feature writing, announced April 13th, 1981, was Jeanette Cook. Although her nomination was originally for local reporting, the board deemed it best to change the category. Jeanette Cook had started her journalistic career for the Ohio-based Toledo Blade, writing for the Blade for 2 years, before interviewing for a position at the Washington Post. She seemed an excellent addition to the newspaper. Having studied at the University of Paris, she spoke French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian, and had won 7 journalism awards at her time in Ohio. It wasn't long until her hiring was shown the correct choice either, when, on September 28, 1980, a story written by her, the story that would go on to win her the 1981 Pulitzer Prize, graced the front page of the Washington Post. It was simply titled, Jimmy's World. The article opened, "Jimmy is 8 years old and a third-generation heroin addict. A precocious little boy with sandy hair, velvety brown eyes, and needle marks freckling the baby-smooth skin of his thin brown arms." The story goes on to detail his life, his start on heroin 3 years ago at age 5, his dream of growing up to be a heroin dealer, and even details how Jimmy's stepfather injected Jimmy right in front of Jeanette. The needle slides into the boy's soft skin like a straw pushed into the center of a freshly baked cake. The article raised a lot of awareness around heroin and drug use in Washington, but also sparked a citywide search for Jimmy. The then Washington City Mayor, Marion Barry, together with city officials and the police, started a search to find Jimmy and get him the help he required. The public were invested too, demanding of the mayor if Jimmy had been discovered yet. The mayor would variously answer yes, he had been discovered and was now in rehab, or that Jimmy had passed away, only to reveal the search was actually still ongoing. The police, as per the New York Times, threatened to subpoena the Washington Post for Jimmy's location, but the newspaper claimed its First Amendment rights and refused. Jeanette's bosses wanted to organize a meeting with Jimmy, but Jeanette sadly informed them that the family had moved away. You can see how such a story, one able to spring from the pages and into the hearts of a city, one able to spark such a frantic and unified search, would be the clear winner of a Pulitzer Prize. The only problem with this story? Jimmy didn't exist. When Jeanette Cook was announced the winner, and details of her journalistic credentials were published, staff at her previous publisher, the Toledo Blade, grew suspicious. Sure, she had won an award during her time there, but not 7, and no one could remember her speaking that many languages. Editors at the Washington Post questioned her about this, tested her language skills, drilled into her background. Then, 2 days after she was announced the winner, on April 15, 1981, staff at the Washington Post were greeted by this note from Janet. Jimmy's world was in essence a fabrication. I never encountered or interviewed an 8-year-old heroin addict. The September 28, 1981, here she had written the wrong year, article in the Washington Post was a serious misrepresentation which I deeply regret. I apologize to my newspaper, my profession, the Pulitzer Board, and all seekers of the truth. Today, in facing up to the truth, I have submitted my resignation. The Pulitzer was returned, journalistic integrity took a massive blow, and Jeanette would never work as a journalist again. In August 1981, a legal suit was filed against the Washington Post, seeking $8.8 million in damages. It was filed by Rufus Calvin Lockridge, of the District of Columbia Board of Education, a man once labeled Public Nuisance Number 1 by the Washington Post. In the lawsuit, he claimed he had an obligation to the citizenry to seek restoration from the Post for the personal and monetary expenses involved with trying to find a child who did not exist. This suit was dismissed in March the following year. My song pairing for this story is from the band Hedgehoppers Anonymous. In 1965, they released a protest song, highlighting the media's focus and attention on bringing bad news to the forefront. A focus that culminated in Jeanette Cook duping a city with a made-up story full of bad news. I'm of course talking about It's Good News Week by the Hedgehoppers Anonymous. Wednesday, April 16th. On this day, not year, a cargo ship has a go at the world record for anchor tossing. Texas City was founded in 1893, after duck hunters a couple of years prior noticed the area would make an excellent port. The hunters, a trio of brothers, formed a syndicate, and after gathering enough investors, bought up the area around Galveston Bay and created Texas City. Opening into the Gulf of Mexico, Texas City served as an industrial port, a hub to many smelters, refineries, and oil production facilities, which for this story was very much to its detriment. The French-owned SS Grand Camp, named after a beach on Normandy, started life off in 1942. It had been constructed in Los Angeles by the California Shipbuilding Corps and christened the SS Benjamin R. Curtis. It was a 134-meter-long steel cargo ship and went on to serve in World War II in the Pacific Theatre. In 1946, it was gifted to France to aid Europe after the end of the war. Which is why, on April 16, 1947, we find it docked at Texas City, loading up for a return voyage to France. The ship was loaded with various cargo, peanuts, tobacco, twine and cotton, but also around 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate, packed into 100-pound or 45-kilogram paper canvas bags. The ammonium nitrate was destined for Europe to be used as fertilizer. At this stage in the story, anyone that is familiar with John Marsden's Tomorrow When the War Began series, particularly the third book, The Third Day of the Frost, or anyone who can remember the Beirut incident of 2020, may have a nagging dread at where this story is going. Ammonium nitrate, by itself, is fairly inert. As per the Petroleum and Explosive Safety Organization website, peso.gov, ammonium nitrate is not an explosive by itself. However, it is one of the ingredients used for manufacture of explosives. For such mixtures to explode, initiators like detonators are required. As per peso, it would take an external detonation to set the nitrate off, or sustained temperatures of around 500 to 572 Fahrenheit, or 260 to 300 degrees Celsius. For those wondering, paper, such as the bags the ammonium nitrate was stored in, has an ignition temperature, that is to say, the temperature it ignites into flames at, of 451 Fahrenheit, or 230 degrees Celsius, and once ignited can reach temperatures above 500 degrees Celsius. So, at around 8 AM on the morning of April 16th, 1947, as smoke started billowing out of the SS Grand Camp's cargo hold, 2 fire extinguishers and a jug of water were levelled at the cargo to no effect. Despite the arrival of the city's volunteer firefighting crew, the captain of the Grand Camp was reluctant to use water on the cargo, fearing it would all be ruined, a fear he didn't need to worry about for much longer. The cargo holds were ordered sealed off, hoping that would starve the fire of oxygen, with steam used to extinguish any remaining flames. Unfortunately, ammonium nitrate, when burning, produces oxygen, and the introduction of water through the steam may have produced nitrous oxide, another volatile substance that, under the right circumstances, can explode. The pressure in the hold grew and grew, acting like a furnace for the growing fire. Finally, the hold's doors burst open, spewing a golden yellow-orange smoke across the bay, visible the town over. This display had the unfortunate effect of drawing in more curious onlookers. Finally, at 9:12 AM, the burning nitrate reached a criticality and exploded. The blast sent a 15-foot, 4.6 meter, tall tsunami crashing onto shore. Flaming bits of cargo and the ship itself were propelled into the air, across the bay and onto the city. The 2-ton anchor of the Grand Camp was found 1.6 miles or 2.5 kilometers away in a 3-meter crater. An oil tank that had been 1,000 feet or 300 meters away from the blast was said to have been crumpled like a piece of tinfoil. Debris landing among the chemical processing plants and oil refineries, turning the air toxic as new fires started, spreading further on waves of burning oil. 2 planes were in the air at the time of the explosion. Both were swatted down by the blast wave. One crashed down next to the Monsanto Chemical Corporation, killing both occupants. A plane, carrying a reporter, went up shortly after the incident, the reporter writing, "I flew over the Texas City disaster area today, over waves of black smoke, which hid all but 5 high clusters of licking flame. A rectangle, roughly a mile long and half a mile wide, along the waterfront, was a mass of twisted steel structures and charred debris." Texas City's mayor, Curtis Trahan, had received the Purple Heart Award in World War II, injured in Belgium from a buzz bomb, something the Axis had nicknamed the Hollen Hund, or Hellhound, a 2,000-kilogram bomb. Mayor Trahan was quoted as saying after the disaster that no buzz bomb could ever compare to what happened here. Another World War veteran, General Jonathan Mainwright, commander of the 4th Army, arrived to offer the support and cooperation of the army, and upon witnessing the destruction said, "I have never seen a greater tragedy in all my experiences." Of the crew that remained aboard the SS Grand Camp, none survived. The explosion so fierce that bodies weren't even recovered. The city's volunteer fire crew that had rushed to the dock were also wiped out. Only one survived among the 28. In total, 581 people were killed by the explosion. Those working on the ship, or the docks, or those who had gathered to watch the spectacle were among the bulk of the casualties. Those that survived didn't escape injury either. First responders reported survivors rushing out of nearby buildings, blood streaming from noses and ears, the result of concussions caused by the shockwave. A shockwave that had shattered windows for as far as 40 miles, or 64 kilometers, with the explosion itself felt up to 240 miles, or 400 kilometers away. Volunteers from across America rushed to the city, from firefighters to doctors, nurses, army personnel, police, and even Boy and Girl Scouts, all unaware that they were walking towards a second ticking bomb. One of the ships that had been docked by the SS Grand Camp, the SS High Flyer, had also been carrying ammonium nitrate, 960 tons of it, plus 1,800 tons of sulfur. It was only later that evening, around 11 p.m., when the now smouldering High Flyer was noticed. Tugboats were called in to try and shift the ship away from the dock, but efforts were abandoned around 1 a.m., with the ship exploding 10 minutes later, 2 more dying in the blast. One of the new victims was a priest, Reverend William A. Roach, who had rushed to the docks to administer last rites on those killed in the first blast. This second explosion sent out a shockwave further destroying the city, with debris reigniting fires and damaging surrounding areas further. As per Wikipedia, the Texas City disaster is generally considered the worst industrial accident in U.S. history. Over 500 lives were lost, 5,000 plus people were injured, and an estimated $100 million worth of damage was caused to the city, which is over $1 billion with inflation today. While I've had the song Ammonia Baby by Junie and the Hut Friends stuck in my head all throughout writing this story, unfortunately ammonia and ammonium nitrate aren't one and the same, which makes the song choice I'm going with even stranger, as TNT also isn't made from ammonium nitrate. However, I think the explosive lyrics and power of the AC/DC song TNT make a more than decent stand-in for this pairing. Watch me explode indeed. Thursday, April 17th. On this day, not year, a flight record is made. Geraldine Jerry Fredericks Mock was born in 1925 in Newark, Ohio. At age 7, she and her father, Timothy Fredericks, and mother, Blanche Fredericks, went for a ride in a Ford Trimotor, an event that would change Jerry's life. The sights she saw that day and the feeling of being free in the air, looking down on the houses and cars, gave her a new goal in life: to become a pilot. This was on top of her 3 other main goals, of course: ride a camel, see the pyramids, and ride on an elephant. Regular listeners may remember a Ford Trimotor last appearing when Elm Farm Ollie, or Sky Queen, took her famous ride on one in 1930. Listen back to episode 6 to learn more, but I digress. Following her dream, of aviation at least, led her to Ohio State University to study aviation engineering. At the time, this was very much a men's club, with Jerry the only woman in the class. This didn't stop her from finishing top of the class, the only one to get full marks in a chemistry test. Her dreams stagnated, as they often do, with marriage in 1945, and a child born in 1947, another in 1948, and her third in 1960. As per womenaviators.org, Jerry complained to her husband of having nothing interesting to occupy her. She wanted to go somewhere. She had already learned to fly. Almost as a joke, Russell replied, "Why don't you fly around the world?" So, on March 19th, 1964, she did just that. She had spent months getting ready for the trip, studying maps, charting her course, applying for visas, flight permissions and insurance, and of course, practicing how to fly. Although both her and Russell had pilot's licenses, Jerry still had very limited time up in an actual plane. To help prepare, she even entered a women's air race, coming in last. The trip would be attempted in a second-hand 1953 Cessna 180 that Jerry had named the Spirit of Columbus, and nicknamed Charlie, after the phonetic alphabet of her plane's registration, N1538C, or 38 Charlie. Much of the flight was sponsored by a $10,000 loan that her local newspaper, the Columbus Dispatch, had provided her, under the condition that she radio back and write exclusive updates about her flight. This worked out well for the newspaper, as not only did Jerry agree to the condition, she also had something that was sure to excite readers further: a rival. 27-year-old Joan A. Merriam, a test pilot, was coincidentally also attempting a solo around-the-world flight, tracing the same path that Amelia Earhart had famously vanished on in 1937. Earhart was a childhood hero to Jerry, and seemingly something of a role model for Miriam, stating that she wanted to complete a page of history by finishing Earhart's trip. While Jerry hadn't accounted for a race, she was in one now. Joan took off 2 days prior, on March 17th, with Jerry lifting off from Columbus, Ohio, March 19th. The last thing she heard the air traffic controllers say over the radio was, "Well, I guess that's the last we'll see from her." The next 29 days would see Jerry travel 22,858 miles, or 36,786 kilometers, singing to herself as she flew from destination to destination, her own radio broken. In Libya, she was nearly run over by a man on a horse, having to jump out of his way, only later discovering she wasn't acting as a woman was supposed to. An idea Jerry had rallied against her entire life, choosing her own path, rather than what society says a woman should be and do. In Guatemala, while trying to file a flight plan, she kept being rebuffed, as they wanted to talk to the pilot, assuming that to be a man. Landing in Saudi Arabia, she exited her plane to silent onlookers, who kept glancing up at the cockpit, waiting for the pilot to follow her out, only to realize she was the pilot and erupt into cheers, shouting out, "There is no man." While in Egypt, she faced a different reception altogether. accidentally putting down in a restricted military base, and being detained at gunpoint. She was eventually released, having passed the time watching television with the soldiers. She then got to realize another of her dreams by visiting the pyramids and riding a camel. She never did encounter that elephant, however. Morocco saw her take inspiration from the food there, learning a local chicken recipe. Each stop would inspire her love of cooking, revealing new cuisines, spices, and recipes. She reached Hawaii on the 13th of April, upset that her husband had cancelled her welcoming party, and instead told her to go to sleep. While it may have been sensible advice, as her next leg of the journey would be a non-stop 18-hour flight to California, Jerry was still peeved, as she had been looking forward to a luau. Finally, on April 17th, 1964, to a cheering crowd of 5,000, Jerry landed back at the Columbus airport she had started from. 29 days and 158 hours of flight time earlier, concluding her reporting for the Columbus Dispatch by stating, "This is the way I believe life should be lived." Joan, despite starting 2 days earlier, wouldn't finish her own around-the-world trip until May 12th, becoming the second woman, after Jerry Mock, to accomplish such a feat. May 4th of 1964, Jerry Fredericks Mock travelled to Washington to meet President Lyndon B. Johnson, together with her family, of her husband, her 3 children and both parents. They met with the president, who awarded the group 2 things. For Jerry, the Federal Aviation Agency's Gold Medal Award, in acknowledgement of her achievement of being the first woman to fly solo around the world. And for Valerie, Jerry's 4-year-old daughter, a White House cake with chocolate letters spelling the words "Happy Birthday." Jerry was also nominated by President Johnson to become the vice chairperson of the newly created Women's Advisory Committee to the Federal Aviation Agency. Looking back on her accomplishment later in life, Jerry reflected, "There were women who told me that they flew because of me. I'm glad I did what I did, because I had a wonderful time." Passing away in 2014 at age 88, Jerry took her final flight aboard a Cessna 180 when her ashes were scattered in the sky. The ending of her one-time rival, Joan Miriam, wasn't as peaceful, dying in a crash in 1965 as her plane suffered a structural failure mid-flight. My song pairing for this story, and one I hope Jerry would have approved of, singing it to herself as she flew from city to city, country to country, is the song "I'll Fly Away" by Alison Krauss. The lyrics, "Like a bird from these prison walls I'll fly away," seem to fit Jerry quite well, flying away from the prison of society she so despised, and to her own freedom. Friday, April 18th. On this day, not year, there is no news. Have you ever heard of the Streisand effect? It was named after singer Barbra Streisand. The Streisand effect stems from 2003, when an image of Barbara's coastal Malibu house was photographed and used in a document to showcase coastal erosion in the area. A very niche article. However, Barbara tried to sue the photographer for $50 million for violation of privacy, and in doing so brought the attention of the media and the public to not only the document, but also the picture of her house. Instead of only a few people viewing the image, and it quickly falling away into obscurity, Streisand's actions had shone more light onto it instead. Prior to the lawsuit, only 6 people had downloaded the image, with 2 of those being her lawyer. By drawing attention with the lawsuit, nearly 500,000 people visited the website to view the image the following month. In a similar way, if you sort of squint a bit, this is what the BBC had done on this day back in 1930. People tuning into the 8:45 news update on the BBC radio were instead met with their presenter simply stating, "Good evening. This is Good Friday. There is no news," before piano music played for the remainder of the 15-minute segment. Unfortunately, we don't know what music was played, but after 15 minutes the radio returned to a program featuring the music of Wagner. Ironically, the fact that there was no news has itself now become newsworthy. The story has since cropped up in places such as BBC quiz show QI in 2004, Series 2, Episode 11. A BBC article from 2017 titled, "There is no news. What a change from 1930 to today." Metro.co.uk in 2024 had an article titled, "Can you believe the BBC once announced there was no news?" And Medium.com in 2025 with the article, "The day BBC announced there is no news." So, I'm sure you're wondering, was there really no news on April 18th, 1930? Well, the British Newspaper Archive has 125 newspapers archived for Friday the 18th of April 1930, so it's not as if no news happened that day. Rather, the BBC were dependent on the same sources that the newspapers relied on, Reuters. As per their website, Reuters, the news and media division of Thomson Reuters, is the world's largest multimedia news provider. Starting in London in the mid-1800s, a controlling interest in the company was bought by the Press Association of Great Britain in 1925, just prior to BBC Radio starting in 1927. Having no reporters of their own, this is where the BBC Radio drew their news stories from. They were just very selective, with an absolute rule laid down that there should be no sensationalism, which was supposedly the case in 1930, as per a BBC News Watch article. The Home Office was desperate to deny a newspaper's account of an interview with the Home Secretary. It was aware that no newspapers would be published over Easter, so it contacted the BBC to ensure the denial was included in the evening radio news. And seemingly the BBC found the easiest way to deny something was to not draw any attention to it at all, declaring no news. As for a song pairing for this newsless day in history, I was originally thinking No Milk Today, and hoping you, my dear audience, would stretch the meaning of the word milk to include news. Instead, and again I'll need you to stretch the definition of the word TV here to include all audio media, I've gone with the song No News on TV by Noga Erez. And let's end with a joke. What did the hangman say when the prisoner got a stay of execution? No noose is good noose. Sorry. I'm so sorry. Saturday, April 19th. On this day, not year, we go for a little bicycle ride. Today we find ourselves going for a little trip on a bicycle through the Swiss town of Basel. But not all is peaceful and scenic. Despite only being a 9-kilometre ride home, something that could be finished in a little under 45 minutes, it seems to be taking forever. And the landscape is constantly changing, spinning and turning, as if seen through a rippling mirror. Just what is going on? For that answer, we need to go back several years. Albert Hofmann was a chemist, working at the Sandoz laboratory in Basel, Switzerland. He had been focusing on the ergot fungus, hoping to use it in a respiratory medicine But after the current batch of lysergic acid diethylamide 25 had failed to provoke the desired effects on the animal test subjects, the project was shelved. It would stay that way for 5 years, until April 16, 1943. For reasons he could never fully explain or understand, Albert had begun thinking of the failed ergot project again, and had wanted to do further testing. It has never been fully explained how, as the acid couldn't be absorbed by the skin, but somehow Albert accidentally consumed some of the ergot concoction, and was shocked by what happened next. Overcome by dizziness in the middle of the day, he excused himself and made his way home, laying down and entering what he described as a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition. It played on his mind all over the weekend, until Monday, April the 19th, arrived, and his plan to further experiment with the acid could be realized. Making it through the work day, Albert, at 4:20 p.m., consumed a 250 microgram dose of lysergic acid diethylamide 25, more commonly known today as LSD. The dose he had consumed, while believing at the time that such a small amount could hardly produce such extraordinary effects, is about 10 times the standard dose of an LSD trip today. 40 minutes later, he would note down beginning dizziness, feeling of anxiety, visual distortions, symptoms of paralysis, desire to laugh. It would be the last thing he was capable of writing down that day. He then, assisted by another from the laboratory, attempted to ride his bike back home. Of the ride, Albert Hofmann would later recount, "Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. It was particularly remarkable how every acoustic perception, such as the sound of a door handle or a passing automobile, became transformed into optical perceptions. Every sound generates a vividly changing image, with its own consistent form and color." On arriving home, Albert asked the assistant to call a doctor, and also requested some milk from his neighbor, hoping the milk would counter the effects of the LSD. While the neighbor happily brought over 2 liters of milk, of which Albert drank it all, he couldn't recognize the woman, instead seeing her as an insidious witch with a colorless mask. Albert had been going through the first bad trip. Feelings of fear, anxiety, depression weighing in on him, he began to wonder if this would be the end, to question how foolish he had been to self-experiment like this. But then the doctor arrived, assured him he was perfectly healthy, and Albert began experiencing a different trip, one of wonder. Writing later, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Albert Hofmann awoke the next day, feeling perfectly fine, better than ever, and went into work like normal. Today, this day is celebrated as Bicycle Day, and Hofmann would spend the rest of his life as an activist for positive drug and LSD use, arguing for its use in psychoanalysis and the positive effects that safe usage of the drug could bring about. He passed away at age 102 in 2008. The second appearance of the Dukes of Stratosphear here, last appearing in episode 8 as a pairing for a story with Dame Agatha Christie. Today I'm offering up their song, Bike Ride to the Moon, for fairly obvious reasons. Sunday, April 20th. On this day, not year, Louis was against this generation of spoil. I'm going to start off this day on a bit of a tangent before getting to the crux of this story, so bear with me. Have you ever played the video game Minecraft? Odds are high, as it is one of the best-selling video games of all time, currently sitting around 350 million copies sold, which is 140 million more than the second best-selling game. In Minecraft, players can explore a randomly generated world made up of cubes, or voxels if you want to be exact. These cubes form different environments and are located in different biomes in the game. Different monsters or creatures spawn in different biomes. For example, mushrooms, a fungus-infested cow, needs the mushroom fields biome in order to spawn, while witches are only generated in swamp biomes. This, as it turns out, isn't too dissimilar to an old theory that many people used to hold in reality, something called spontaneous generation. It was an attempt to explain where some life came from, with the idea that living creatures could be generated from inert material. As per Britannica.com, according to that theory, pieces of cheese and bread wrapped in rags and left in a dark corner, for example, were thus thought to produce mice, because after several weeks there were mice in the rags. The theory didn't just stop at mice either. Wikipedia lists several more. Frogs from mud, snakes from human spines, bees from decomposing cows, while wasps were from decomposing horses, and bookworms came from the wind. It was thought that rotting meat would generate maggots, while fleas and dust mites would arise from dust and dirt. Other, somewhat related beliefs have geese growing from bushes or trees, and sheep being grown from cotton plants. You would think that would be fairly easy to disprove, as correlation rather than causation. A little investigative work here, and some basic science and attentiveness there being the only things required. But the belief in spontaneous generation held true for at least 2,000 years. That is, until Louis Pasteur got involved with it. Louis Pasteur was born in 1822 in Dole, France. Initially, he held no interest in study or chemistry, despite being surrounded by inspirations. His sister catching a virus when she was 3 and suffering lifelong effects, or a rabid wolf hounding his city, those bitten having no protection against the deadly virus. Finally, he started applying himself, and at age 21 in 1843, made it into an elite publicly funded school and found himself under the tutelage of noted chemist Jean-Baptiste Dumas. After graduation and becoming a professor himself, chance saw him chasing a fermentation problem in 1854, attempting to solve why some batches of beet alcohol would go bad while others remained perfectly fine. This led to him inventing the basics of pasteurization, realizing that the spoiled batches had attracted bacteria that could be killed off by heating the liquid up to a set temperature. Shortly after this discovery, another scientist, Félix Pouchet, had made steps in proving that spontaneous generation was a plausible theory, even if he had only managed to generate microorganisms so far. The French Academy of Science posted a competition, wanting others to either prove or disprove Pouchet's proof. Here Louis was able to further expand on the discoveries he had made with the beet alcohol, knowing that external contamination and heat were both important factors. He attempted to utilize both to show that spontaneous generation was best left in the past. A swan neck flask, a glass flask with a large S-shaped neck protruding out, was filled with broth, boiled to sterilize any current bacteria, cooled off and left alone. The broth didn't generate any life, remaining clear. The swan neck of the flask, despite being open to the air, trapped any incoming microbes in the damp environment of the elongated thin neck. The neck was broken off, and with air now having free flow into the broth, quickly began contaminating it. It was on this day, April 20th in 1862, when Louis Pasteur demonstrated the technique he had learned and expanded on during the previous trials with the alcohol and then spontaneous generation. Louis Pasteur was awarded 2,500 francs for his findings in this experiment, a prize handed to him by the French Academy of Sciences. So it was now the era of pasteurization, and that was it for spontaneous generation. While a few believers clung on to the idea into the 1900s, it wasn't a strong enough following to generate any wider belief. Interestingly, I've known a few in my time who believe in spontaneous degeneration, with the belief that if they leave a task alone long enough, say the dirty dishes for instance, the mess will spontaneously vanish. Now, a song pairing for this story, something that can reflect both this new era of more shelf-stable and bacteria-free food, as well as the previous beliefs around spontaneous generation. The only song I can think to put forward for such a pairing is by Lieutenant Pigeon, the song Mouldy Old Dough, which I'm sure must generate pigeons if thrown out in the yard. Now, time for the moment that I know some of you dread, the quiz. So, pens and paper at the ready. Feel free to pause if you must, but here we go regardless. Question 1, Monday. What town did the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight take place in? Question 2 for Tuesday. What was the name of the fictitious boy that Janet Cook had cooked up? Question 3 for Wednesday. How far was the SS Grand Camp's anchor flung in the explosion? Question 4 for Thursday. What trouble did Jerry find herself in when she landed in Egypt? Question 5 for Friday. What time was the "There is no news" read out? Saturday. What did Albert Hoffman request from his neighbor? And finally, question 7 for Sunday. According to the spontaneous generation theory, how are bees and wasps made? Hopefully you have something written down for everything, as here are the answers. The answer to question 1 is El Paso, Texas. Question 2 for Tuesday, Jimmy was the imaginary child's name. Answer 3 for Wednesday, the anchor was flung 1.6 miles or 2.5 kilometers. Answer 4 for Thursday, Jerry landed at a military base. Answer 5 for Friday. The news, or lack of it, was read out at 8:45 p.m. Answer 6 for Saturday. He wanted milk from his neighbor, got 2 liters of the stuff, and downed it all. And finally, the answer to question 7 from Sunday. According to the spontaneous generation theory, how are bees and wasps made? From decomposing animals. Wasps from horses and bees from cows. Which brings us to the end of another episode. How did you do in the quiz this week? Thanks for listening to another episode of This Day Not Year. I hope you had a good time along the way, learned some new facts, and have a greater appreciation for the week ahead. If you have enjoyed your time with me today, be sure to rate the podcast, and if you're feeling particularly extroverted, feel free to share the episode with friends and family too. As ever, you can reach me on thisdaynotyear@gmail.com for any corrections, suggestions, or just for whatever reason. Join me again next week as we look at the 21st to the 27th of March. I've been your host Adam, you've been listening to This Day Not Year, and I hope you have an historic week ahead. Until next time.